Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Today I'm joined by my pretty regular guest, Paul Hoppe. And Paul, I want to thank you for being a friend. I want to thank you for going down the road and back again. And because of that, today we're going to talk about something I know that's dear to your heart, that you have reintroduced me to, and that frankly, in the wake of the passing of Betty White, it is particularly appropriate for us to talk about. We are talking about the super heroic ability to survive on a teacher's salary in Miami. The Golden Girls. We're going to get into all that.
A substitute teacher's salary, no less.
A substitute teacher salary, no less. It's amazing the things you can do if you grew up in Sicily. All that and more after commercial break. We have no control over. Welcome back. This is Matthew, your host. I'm joined, as I said, by Paul. And for the last couple of months, really, maybe even a year, Paul and I have been bouncing around the idea of doing something about Golden Girls. It's a show that I watched when I was a very little kid, maybe like 10 or 11 on syndication. A lot of it went over my head. Paul, I know, got back into it more recently and has been telling me a lot more about it. And so I think we were thinking about when would be a good time to jump into it. And then with the recent passing of Betty White, it seemed just the perfect time. And I wanted just to start there because Betty White is obviously a very big part of this show, but it's just become kind of like an important part of our culture in all sorts of ways. And so we're going to just start by like remembering Betty White and her passing. Paul, what for you is Betty White in terms of like her importance and meaning in our culture?
Yeah. I mean, she's been around a long time, like almost 100 years. My thought was like, oh, let's do an episode on her 100th birthday. And she didn't quite make it, but 99 right. And 11 months is a if that's about how long I live, I won't be well, whatever. Anyway, I think a lot of people, think of her in recent years as sort of like America's grandmother or something in quotes. But I think it's important to remember, like, she was in show business when she was a lot younger as well. And, she
right.
managed to be relevant through a lot of different phases of her life. And, more recently, I think being able to show, like, yeah, you can be 95 or 93 or whatever she was and host Saturday Night Live and be funny, and, not that you should feel like you have to be doing a bunch of things when you're in your 90s, but you can, and
right.
You can do that whether you started when you were younger or when you're older. And so I think in a lot of ways, she helped kind of break a lot of stereotypes that people have about older people, a lot of assumptions that people have. It was 30-ish years ago when she was on the Golden Girls and playing a character who was older than most protagonists in shows. And
right.
maybe it was 30 years before that. Maybe it was 20 years before that she was on the Mary Tyler Moore Show as a very different character. And, she had her own show in the 50s, right?
Right.
And was, I think she was the first woman to have I think it was a variety show, right? And go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, she was either the first or one of the first, and then also was pretty out there in terms of the things that she was pushing to have on her show and the people she was to have on her show.
Exactly. And, and her producer, she insisted on having, her producer was a black man that she had insisted on having be her producer, and there was pressure on her to change, and she refused to, and I think the show ended up getting canceled as a result, which is horrible, but I think I think she's, she showed in her life how you can push barriers on your own, and then you can also try to kind of help more people come along with you. And she was also just really funny, like, on a lot of different shows and in a lot of different ways, sometimes, as Rose, she plays this very literal-minded, naive kind of character, though who does have other facets, but then she also
right.
played very promiscuous characters and originally she was going to be Blanche in the Golden Girls, you know?
Yeah.
And then they're like, actually, let's switch it up, you know? And they got...
Which I've never heard Betty White do a Southern accent, but apparently she was quite good at it.
Right. I'm sure, you know? I mean, she was a great actress and comedian, and then also animal rights advocate, you know? Back before it was really popular, you know? And... I mean, at one point, I think she described her life as being half show business and half animals, like loving animals and trying to take care of them. And that's obviously something that's, you know, dear to my heart. And, you know, I think, like, when she was younger, she was that sort of, what to me seems kind of paradoxical, like, animal lover and advocate who's, like, not a vegetarian, and on some level, that sort of doesn't compute to me. It seems like a sort of a little bit of cognitive dissonance. But then I think later in life she did become a vegetarian, and I think ultimately vegan towards the end of her life. And like I saw some like Twitter outrage that like she ate one hot dog in like 2011, and I'm like, can we realize this is a person who was born in like 1921, you know, who like had this arc of, you know, just already caring about animals and trying to fight for them, and then over time gradually kind of refining what that means to her, you know?
Right.
And I think that can be a lot of people's journeys, you know? It's like we don't always have to go to whatever our final position is going to be. Like, it's life is a process, and, you know, we can have a lot of different phases through it.
And I think that there's a lot about the show Golden Girls itself we want to get into, but I want to just harp on that because one thing we talk about a lot on this show, you know, is the idea of the people who create the stuff that we love, you know, when they sometimes aren't, you know, either they have attitudes or ideas in their shows or otherwise that aren't the best, or even when, like, they create something and at a time it's great, but then 20 or 30 years later it doesn't look the best. And, you know, like Joss Whedon, I think we often talk about, like, Buffy the Vampire Slayer at its time was doing a lot to sort of, you know, push the idea of female characters and protagonists and heroes into new places. But then 20 years later, was still kind of writing the same stories and being critiqued for it. And in Betty White's case, you're talking more about her personal life, but still it's that idea of being able to say, like, yeah, to be an animal rights activist in the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, like, the idea, I think for most, there were vegetarians to be sure, there probably even vegans, but like, in the Overton window of what does it mean to be an animal rights activist didn't really include what you eat. It just wasn't part of the conversation for the most part. As she, at least in many of those conversations, as she, you know, but from what you're saying, it really sounds like she's someone who, as that Overton window changed, as she heard more understandings and perspectives, she also shifted and changed. And to me, that's, I think, one of the things you can most admire about a person is the ability to say, like, yeah, here's where I am in terms of this issue now, and then 20 or 30 years later, I'm not just going to sit on my laurels and say, well, I made this cool statement that people thought was important 20 years ago. The issue has changed, and so I'm going to change with it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you know, I think the Overton window is a good way of kind of framing it. You know, I would say within the Overton window specifically of animal rights, that was probably a thing for a long time. But in terms of sort of the, you know, greater Overton window of society, which is a little narrower than in any given area. You know, I mean, I became a vegetarian in 1984, and in 1987 or 8 or 9 or something, I went to baseball camp, and when I told people I was a vegetarian, they're like, "You're a veterinarian?" And I was like, "No, but I guess that's close." Yeah. But like people didn't even know what I was talking about, you know, in the 80s. Or then in the 90s, kind of people had an idea. And then, like, you know, that was kind of when someone was like, you know, like, dairy's not the best. And I was like, what do you mean? And I was like, aren't they from happy cows? Yeah. It's like, not so much. And, like, I think people just, you know, we don't learn everything about the world all at once, and we don't have all of our thoughts at once. And as, you know, it's like, to me, you know, it's not like we're limited by whatever the thoughts of others around us are, but we can be pushed or pulled by them, right? And so I just think having the openness and the willingness to listen to new ideas and change as we, you know, get older, acquire more experience, learn more about the world, as, you know, we do, as long as we're listening and paying attention to it, I don't know. I think that's a good aspect of one's character to have and maintain, whatever those changes are,
sure.
right? I mean, they don't have to be about animal rights, right? They can be about any issue. Just like if we're always increasing our understanding of the world around us, hopefully we'll end up making better decisions as life goes on.
I mean, I've been making this podcast for 5 years now, and you actually started with me. And I'm sure that if we went back and listened to some of the episodes we made in like the first year, there are some positions, at least I think that I took, that I'd be like, I think I'd be a little more nuanced on that. I think I would, I think just, if nothing else, just like, I think there's a lot of those things that you hope you change and you grow. One quick thing I want to mention, I think the story of the producer may also be true, but the story that I know is that Arthur Duncan, who became a really well-known dancer and entertainer, got his start as a guest on the Betty White show. He was black, and that was one of the things that caused quite a lot of controversy, and a lot of the Southern syndicates didn't want to carry the show, and she said, quite famously, no, he's my guest, we're sticking with it. And apparently also she would also do a children's section on the show, and she had a black child as part of kind of the kids she would interview, which was also somewhat new at the time. So that was actually the story that I was attempting to tell. I think she was actually the producer, and I think she was the first woman who was the producer of her own show, and it's the tap dance. It's Arthur Duncan, who I was talking about, but I just learned about this recently, and thus was essentially blathering incoherently for about a minute. But yes, thank you for giving the actual story of the thing that happened, and thus I have learned more now. I tend to believe that as long as the facts are within the veil of the truth, that matters. But Paul has reminded me that facts that are technically true are better facts, and so those are the facts we try to have. Yes, what I said was in the spirit of the truth, but what you said was, in the actual truthiness of the truth. Exactly. So now let's step out of 1984 into the show from 1984, The Golden Girls. Because that's obviously the thing I think that Betty White is generally most known for, or at least for a while. She's obviously done quite a lot since then. And before, yeah. Hot in Cleveland, SNL, and then just kind of being just a general, like, cultural figure. But the show Golden Girls, because I have to admit, when you told me a couple of years ago that you were really into it and really enjoying it, my memory of it was watching it when like I said, I was like 10 or 11 years old. It was on syndication, and it was just a show about, this is the way I thought of it at the time, old women being funny and living in Miami and kind of having foibles. And that's all I really knew about it and all I really remembered about it. And it seemed like it was just one of 30 sitcoms at the time that were mildly amusing, but not really worth remembering. And then I started seeing, you talking about it, a lot of other people talking about it, and the queer community talking about it as this thing that they were completely embracing. Like, what is it about Golden Girls that really spoke to you? Yeah, so I'll credit it with sort of the reason that Lee and I are together. Like, when we'd been together for like the first year or so of living together, we would watch The Golden Girls at 1 a.m. till, I think it was like 1 a.m. till 2 a.m. Maybe Frasier was part of that. I don't know. But there was like an hour of Golden Girls every night around when we go to sleep. You put it on and go to sleep and then turn the TV off or whatever. Back when we actually had a TV with like stations and stuff. Right. Network television. And as couples often do, we had disagreements over time. And, there's moments where it's like we almost broke up. And like one of the reasons that I really didn't want to was like this feeling of like that thing that we share together like would no longer be there, and it's like sometimes it's the small things I think that are important in relationships. It's like my memories of other relationships might be like eating pasta and watching X-Files, and right. And so that just, we ended up actually getting all the discs. Like I have the complete 7 seasons on DVD, and basically for a number of years, like that's like our sleep show. Like you put it on, go to sleep.
but like watch, you know, or listen to like the first couple episodes. If you don't sleep as well, you hear episodes 3 and 4. Sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and hear episodes like 7 or 8 on the disc. So I definitely know the episodes that are at the beginning of each disc better than the ones that are at the end of each disc.
That's fair. That's fair.
So, you know, it just became like a significant part of my life without being this really active thing, right? And I think one thing that happens with shows sometimes is there's this feeling of kind of like knowing the characters and them being sort of like friends.
Yeah.
And it does feel like a particularly cozy show, in that it's this found family, and they're basically almost always in the house, right? The 4 of them and like 1 or 2 or 3 other characters in a given episode. And kind of, you know, they've got conflict, but things generally work out. Or they always work out by the end of the episode or the 2-episode arc or whatever. But they also deal with a lot of things that I feel like in the 80s and early 90s, not a lot of shows were really doing, you know?
Yeah.
And then also just having a show that has, you know, not young women as the protagonists is just so rare. You know, it's just, there've been a couple since then, but like very few. And the fact that it embraces the characters and their ages, but doesn't make that like the thing about all of the characters. Because what happens on a lot of shows is you'll have one older character, and the thing about that character is that they're older. Right, and maybe they have one other characteristic. But here you've got 4 fully formed characters who have, you know, very complex histories over 100 episodes. And it's like a kind of representation that you just don't see that much. And I don't know, maybe for me, like growing up in a house with like just my mom after I was 8, right? Or 8 and some months. Seeing like, and, you know, at that time, my mom was younger than most of the Golden Girls are. But, like, I don't know. Like, my mom was one of the most important people in my life. She still is, you know. She's one of my best friends. And so seeing, you know, a woman of her age, like her age now, and when I was younger, her age was like Blanche's age or whatever. Like, seeing that actually represented in fiction, it matters to me, you know.
You know, it's funny. I want to say a quick thing about just the serious topics, because I think that's the thing that I missed when I watched it when I was 10 or 11, you know, 11 or 12, whatever. Like, I thought some things were funny, but later, both before Betty White passed, but especially in the last week or two, I've gone back and been watching a lot of old episodes and realizing, like, almost all the time they're dealing with serious things in serious ways with a lot of humor. There's a lot of other great stuff there you threw out that I also want to get into. But let's just start with the age part, because I think it's hard to imagine how revolutionary it was in the 80s, in part because it's still quite revolutionary today, to have a show like this where, like you said, all the protagonists are, I think they're all supposed to be in their 50s.
So I think Blanche is like early 50s, and Dorothy and Rose start off in their late 50s and then end up in their 60s, and Sophia starts in her late 70s and ends up in her 80s.
That sounds right. Yeah, Blanche is definitely a couple of years younger than the rest of them. But like you said, often, especially the stuff, I mean, I remember when I watched this, let me actually kind of back up a second here, because I think it kind of helps say something about perceptions of age. All I remembered about the show was it was about old women. And so in my mind, as I then let it bet, when I was amazed to realize they were in their 50s, because I think it had become sort of the Mandela effect kind of thing. I thought it was a show about people in their 70s. In part because I think, because I was 11, but also like the way that aging is often portrayed in Hollywood, especially for women, is, you know, once you're past 30, you're just old, or even past 40. And the difference between like, well, you're 50 or you're 70, it doesn't matter, because you are just old. And the fact that this show was taking that on directly, and so much of it was about, you know, these women still having active sexual lives, being vibrant, being bowling and playing tennis and doing like all sorts of things that, I mean, I'm in my mid 40s. I'm not that far away from some of this, you know, and certainly having seen, it's kind of hard to talk about in part because like since the 80s, just the medicine and technology has changed so much that like what a person can be like in their 50s, 60s, and 70s has changed so much dramatically. But still, I think so much of the show is challenging what was thought then and what's thought today about what does it mean to be older, but also especially to be an older woman.
Yeah, I think like when I was a kid, like everybody over 30 seemed like they were 100. Right. Like,
yeah, exactly.
So I think there wasn't that specific a perception of age, or it was like anyone from like 20 to 40 was like parent age, and anyone over like 40 or 50 was just like ancient. But like, obviously our perceptions of age are going to change as we age. Right. And being able to kind of tell roughly how old someone is. But yeah, there was a lot of, there's still a lot of ageism, right? Like everywhere in society, but it is still more directed at women. And at that point, I think, you're absolutely right. It was like, there's like this cutoff, right? And as women kind of age out of a certain age, sort of character range, I think there's this huge pressure or temptation to try and remain younger, essentially, right? And I mean, I think that's got its whole things. I will say, like, when I was a kid, my grandfather was like, or my grandpa was like, he was bowling in his 80s, So it's not like people weren't still doing things. Like my Nana, my dad's mom was doing Tai Chi until she was, 90 or 90 something. I forget how old she ended up, dying at. But like she was like, these were grandparents who were very, very physically active into their 80s. And, that's that's always been a thing. It's like now it feels like maybe it's more prevalent, right? There's more encouragement for people to do that. But I think there's always been this like perception that like everybody's kind of the same in a certain, I guess it's just like a stereotype.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, we're kind of talking about how this show fits in against what else was in Hollywood at the time and since then, not lived reality, because it doesn't have anything to do with lived reality.
Right, exactly.
And that's the thing is, like, I might know, like, in my case, my parents had me quite late, and their parents had them quite late. So for me, I think that was a part of it. For me, grandparents were people in their 70s and 80s. Right. By the time I was 3 or 4, both of my grandfathers had passed away. My grandmothers were at kind of like nursing home age already. So to me, that was also part of it. It's like grandmother meant 75 and in a nursing home. Whereas like the characters in the Golden Girls are grandparents. I think all 3 of them are grandparents.
Yeah. And Sophia's a great grandparent.
But like I said, yeah, but they're in their 50s and 60s. I think another thing, and I think that's the thing is like, like we might have had these individual experiences, but then when all the TV shows, all the movies, what I remember about that point is most of the time, if older women were being talked about, it was often like the male character in a sitcom talking about how awful his mother-in-law is, the battle axe jokes and all this kind of stuff. And if ever an older woman's sexuality was being mentioned, especially, it was always in this horrible thing. It was like this, like, oh, it's so scary and horrible that you're being hit on, or like in a lot of the kind of like, teen romp movies, that was always the horrible thing. It's like you get hit on by your friend's mother who's in her. This was not the Skylar's mom is hot kind of idea. This was the like, a woman in her 40s or 50s is hitting on you. That's the scariest thing that you could imagine. And so, I think it really underscores why this show was so different.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, like, they all have their sexuality, but it's not the same, right? And there's certain jokes, there's, like, a lot of slut-shaming directed at Blanche, but it's not, it feels, like, less judgmental in some ways than it often is, because it's, like, she's one of the main characters, and she is who she is, and unapologetically so, And so, while there are jokes that are kind of like, maybe that's not the best, they also were representative of a lot of, of the the norms at the time, and sort of how the characters, some of them break the norms, you know, and then you get Rose, who's not as much, not as promiscuous, right? But still has, you know, interest, and that gets to be an issue. Like the first man she's with after her husband dies, like, and these are issues that are real, that people encounter throughout life, right? And that just, I think, didn't get covered very much. Not like I watched every piece of media up until 1980, whatever, but like, you know, I don't remember seeing it anywhere else.
Yeah, no, I think it's very true. And I think in a lot of ways, the way that Blanche's sexuality is treated is kind of one of those examples of kind of what we were talking about before, where it's like, it is progressive of its time, even though a lot of it looks terrible to us today. You know, I think that it comes off as very slut-shamey, but the simple fact that she got to be a full character where they tease her about her promiscuity, but she teases them about being prudes, and she gives as good as she gets, like, that alone, you know, and so I think, if you read it today, there's some lines where I'm like, you know, and except, like, there's a lot of those things about the show, you know, like there are, one of the first episode, I think the first episode is about Rose entering menopause, and Blanche entering menopause, and it's done, and again, that's like, you know, talking about women's periods was, to me, that, you know, as a 12-year-old boy, taught like that's the grossest thing in the world. We're never going to talk about that on television. And so there's some great moments of them like going to a doctor's office and like having these important like feminist understandings in the doctor's office, and then making a joke about the doctor being Jewish.
Right.
It's just like, it's in part, if for nothing else, it's fascinating to me for that, to watch like, what does it mean for a show to be progressive in its time, and still like, I think they make fun of anti-Semitism quite a lot, but also that's just they do episodes about like, you know, the Latinx people in Miami not being treated well, and then also have a lot of jokes about the gardener Fernando. Right. Like it's such I think it's the kind of show where it'd be very easy to watch it and just say, oh, this is racist, this is sexist, this is all the problems of the 80s. And it is, but it also there's so much contained in it that I think gets missed if you just see that.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, this is the thing about comedy is that a lot of jokes aren't going to age that well. And, you know, some of those people should have seen coming, you know, but some of them also, it's just like, all right, I mean, people's understanding of the world changes individually and collectively. Yeah. And so, I don't know, I do kind of buy the little bit of a comedy carve out where it's like, look, if something makes you feel uncomfortable, I'm certainly not going to say, hey, this shouldn't make you feel uncomfortable, you know?
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's like, you know, some things are going to be misses. And, you know, in terms of anti-Semitism, like, there's a whole episode where they're going to go to this, you know, the Mortimer Club or whatever. And then, you know, it's just like, oh, he can't come. And it's like, oh, his tuxedo? What? And it's like, no, because he's Jewish. And it's like, oh, yeah, no, we're not going to be friends anymore because you're willing to go to a club. Yeah. But then, you know, there's also jokes like, why are so many doctors Jewish? Because their mothers are. And I don't know. Maybe that one's not really anti-Semitic, but it's certainly sort of stereotypical. And, you know, there's some other things here and there. You know, and it's just like, I think the same thing when it comes to, you know, gay characters and representation, you know. And, you know, in terms of trans characters, maybe it's a little bit more on, you know, the sort of offensive side, right? Like Dorothy's brother is, I mean, I don't know whether Dorothy's brother is precisely trans, because Dorothy's brother never shows up on screen, right?
Yeah, this is an issue that's gotten talked about quite a lot, and I want to get more into kind of where the show fits in terms of the queer community and how beloved it's become. But this issue particularly gets talked about a lot, and often kind of mentioned as one of the things that the show didn't do the best job on. He's a cross-dresser, I think, and but even there, also, like, the language that we use around being transgender, 90% of it that we use today didn't exist in the 80s, you know? Like, non-binary, or, like, talking about the difference between being a transvestite versus being transgender versus cross-dressing. Like, So it's kind of hard to say where he fits. He's probably the butt of a lot more jokes than he needed to be. But I think one of the things that the show does is, and this is the kind of thing that, like, I think today, because we understand microaggressions a lot more, shows don't do this, and maybe that's a good thing. But I think the show chooses a very fine line between the idea of, like, we're going to poke what it thinks is lighthearted fun at everybody, but then when we have serious discussions, we're going to be solidly on the side of against racism, against sexism, against misogyny, against ageism, against queerphobia or transphobia even. And, you know, like I said, I think sometimes that poking fun goes a little further than you probably want it to. And that's where it gets into some complicated issues. Yeah. But when it really tackles issues, it's remarkably progressive.
Right, exactly. And I feel like, I mean, there's a quote from Blanche where she says something like, you know, you tease the ones you love, tease and tickle and spank. But, like, you know, that's the way, that's the way Blanche says things. But, like, I spared you my version of her Southern accent, but, you know,
the best.
But, like, I think that's to some extent sort of the show's attitude is, like, we are going to kind of tease everybody a little bit. And, you know, there are a lot of things where it's like, there's ways to have fun with aspects of people's identity without being really mean-spirited. But then sometimes those aren't going to, you know, it's like, they say, like, you've got to read the room, right? But, like, when you're making a TV show, it's like the room is like, I don't know, the national collective unconscious or the international collective unconscious. And it's like, you know, they definitely missed some. And I totally agree in terms of Phil. I will say that, I guess spoilers if you haven't gotten up to this point, but at Phil's funeral, they get into it a lot. And there is a lot of that I think absolutely it's uncomfortable and doesn't feel like it's done the best. But at the same time, there is a moment towards the end when, you know, which I think is very poignant. And I wish they, like, went one more step with it, but, like, you know, Sophia's basically like, you know, she felt like, what did I do to make him this way, right? Which I think is a very common, unfortunate thing that parents feel. The thing that she says then that I think makes it play a little better is that then she's like, but, you know, I loved him. And it didn't matter to me, you know. She felt this, like, she didn't understand, you know.
Right.
And it would have been nice if they then could have gone past that to sort of have somebody in the room be like, that's, and I think somebody was like, that's just Phil, you know. It's, but, like, somebody be like, look, that's not something you did. That's just who Phil was. And, like, you know, you loved him, and, like, regardless of not understanding. And I think sometimes that's important to be able to be like, look, I don't understand what you're going through. I don't understand your perspective. I've tried, but regardless, you know, I love you. I care about you, and I accept that you are who you are, right? Even if I don't get it. I mean,
Rose gets to have a moment where she basically says that, in a moment where when Dorothy's, the topic of homosexuality, what we now refer to as queerness, comes up a lot. And there was a character in the first episode, Coco, the gay chef, who you kind of imagine that he was going to be that, like, kind of like Will and Grace 20 years beforehand, where, like, 80% of it was people making gay jokes at him, but then him laughing back, and you're sort of like so glad that this is the first gay character who gets to be on TV for a while. But also, oh my God, the things are being said to him are horrible. But, like, it turned out even that was too much for TV at that time.
Are you sure that that's so I heard a different reason that he didn't remain in the show. I certainly...
I'm going to hear the other... What I heard was that was a part of it, but that it was also just like that they really liked the idea of it being just the four women, and him there kind of would take away from it somewhat.
And I think the idea that he was like the cook, and then like once Sophia shows up, like she's like gonna be in the kitchen a lot cooking. You know, it's the whole great Italian chef thing. But I mean, at the same time, it's like it's not hard to believe that it's like whoa, a gay character in the main cast. This is 1985, like.
But what I was saying was, I think in the first season, but certainly pretty early on, there's an episode where Dorothy's former college roommate, I think, who's
Jean.
still been a very good friend, who is a lesbian, comes and develops a crush on Rose. And what Rose says is something kind of along the lines of what you were kind of saying you wish with Phil, where she says, like, I don't understand your feelings and I don't return them, but if I did, I think I'd be very flattered.
Right.
You know, and it's very clear that she's saying, like, I'm not judging you. I don't get it, but I don't need you. I don't need to get it to respect you and to be honored that you find me attractive in that way, even if that's not what I'm going to do.
And can we
when I am myself.
Can we be friends? You know, can we just be friends? And she's
right.
like, yeah. Blanche, on the other hand, is like, she's attracted to Rose. Like, why isn't she attracted to me?
Yeah, and that's I think with both Rose and then also with an episode they later do with Blanche and her
brother.
Is it Blanche's
Yes.
brother? Yeah, brother who wants to get married.
Clayton.
One of the things that I really like is it's not that our heroes are all super progressive off the bat, you know, with all their ideas. Often what we see is them learning along with the audience. And so yeah, it's that kind of thing where it's like Blanche starts out being kind of homophobic and says some things that are meant to be very funny while being homophobic and are sort of like, yeah, you get why they're very funny jokes, except that they're really problematic in some ways. But the point is that it's that the character isn't there yet, and the character gets to learn. And in this case, it's Sophia saying, you know, well, why did you want to get married? Why was it important to you? Why shouldn't Clayton get to have the same thing?
Yeah, and I think, you know, I think that's often a good format, right, for kind of giving the audience a chance to kind of come along with a character, you know, because, I mean, if you do have audience members who are, you know, homophobic, which, like, you do, right? Like, that's a thing. But, like, ones who aren't necessarily, like, virulently so, you know, who maybe have an open mind, and it's sort of like, I think it's a way to be like, look, we get it, like, this might be where you are, but, like, try coming over to here, you know? And with Blanche...
I mean, especially, like, in the 80s, I would have said, like, homophobic meant the people who go up and, like, beat up gay people. And, like, if you just thought, like, yeah, gay people should live their lives, but they shouldn't get married, because that's just what straight people do. Like, I think in the 80s we wouldn't have thought of that as homophobic. That was just the normal thing.
That was definitely the default population of, you know, position of the majority of the population, I'm sure.
Exactly. I think today we'd see it. All of it's homophobic, to be sure. But yeah, and so where Blanche is representing probably is pretty radical where she winds up.
And I also think that, like, in that arc, because that's, like, 2 episodes, right? There's the one where her brother comes out to her, but first lies about actually being with Rose. Rose somehow always ends up in all of this. But, like, and then Blanche has a process of, like, just accepting that, right? But then later, when he's getting married, then she has to kind of cross another bridge, essentially, like, in terms of acceptance, you know, and she gets there as well eventually, you know. And so I think this sort of, like, non-linear, like, you go from, you know, not understanding a thing and not accepting it to, like, just being like, okay, I totally, you know, it's like that's not necessarily the way things always work. And so also showing a character kind of struggle to get there, I think can be helpful, I think.
Yeah. I think, like, another episode that really struck me, and I'm mostly using episodes from the earlier part of the seasons because that's mostly what I've seen, but I also am remembering and have read about quite a lot of others. Again, in the first season, there's an episode where Dorothy starts dating a man who Blanche found attractive, and Dorothy is clearly kind of enjoying the fact that this guy's into her and not Blanche, and that she's winning. Because there's some competitiveness there. And we see him make a very forward pass against, I say against quite literally. I mean, basically, like, you know, sexually assaults her. Nothing happens much beyond, like, hands, but, like, it's not okay in any way what he does. And Blanche, like, you know, says no, pushes him away. And then when she tells Dorothy can't believe it. Dorothy basically does the slut-shaming of, well, she doesn't say, like, you know, Blanche, you were asking for it by any means, but she basically assumes that Blanche is making this up because she doesn't want Dorothy to be with this guy. And sort of the unspoken thing here that's very clear is Dorothy sort of feeling like, well, she just doesn't believe Blanche, you know, in part because of the competitiveness, but I think in part because of Blanche's promiscuity. And I remember watching it and thinking, like, the words "Me Too" are never spoken. The words that are used today around, like, believe women are never spoken, but that's exactly the theme of the episode.
Sure.
And you get to see Dorothy, who's in some ways, I think, kind of the main protagonist of the four, be very wrong.
Yeah.
And admit that.
Yeah, and have to understand that, she was making bad assumptions, right? And kind of seeing things how she wanted to. And not believing her very good friend, and instead believing this dude she'd met for like a few weeks or something, which is like, right. But people do that, right? And I think Dorothy is the most central character, in that it's like, it's her, she lives with her friends. I mean, they were just roommates at first, right? But they became friends, and then her mother moves in. So she's kind of, the linchpin kind of.
I just have to say, in one of the most sort of like, you forget sometimes just how contrived plot lines were in the 80s. It's just, Sophia was staying in a nursing home. The nursing home burned down. Now she's living with us. That's it. There's nothing else about it. Like, I kept being like, wait, really? That's all? Okay. That's the situation of situation comedies did not need to stand up to much.
Right.
It was.
This happens. Okay. I'll take it. Everyone's okay. No one died. The home burned down. Like, I like that's, when she enters. I got the first line wrong.
What are other kind of particular things about the show you think that really strike you as important? Are there issues it covered, or just kind of the way it did things?
Yeah, I mean, there's an extent to which the people on the show kind of got to get some of their issues, and like circling back to Betty White, she was a big animal rights activist, and so she got some more kind of like animal episodes in there where there were dogs who were characters, and you mentioned the mink breeding, which like it's
for those who know, the first episode they've like bought minks to breed. I remember contacting Paul and being like, really? These are your characters?
that was the first episode that I recommended. I think that's not the pilot. But
okay, yeah, you're right.
But yeah, I think that's season 1. It's very early on. That's the one where Blanche's menopause, where Blanche is going through menopause and she's having all these feelings about it. And I think the mink thing, when Dorothy asks Rose about it, her view is this like very sort of pro-animal farmer kind of view, where she's like, animals are born, they serve man, and then they go to heaven. And Dorothy's like, heaven? She's like, yeah, there's but like, and so that's not my view, right? And I think, as I said, like, I think throughout life, it's kind of you can make progress, not all at once necessarily, but, at the end of the episode, they're like, well, they're non-breeding minks. And I think 2 of the minks are gay, but they don't want to make more minks, and they're like, we can't, so should we get rid of them? And then Blanche is saying like, so are you saying that just because the minks can't have babies, they're useless? And they're like, the minks stay. Or maybe Rose says that, and then Blanche is like, the minks stay. Anyway, sort of the way the episode ends up, like, I'm good with it. Like, their plan is to breed minks. It doesn't work out. They end up having mink pets for a little while, and then the next show, they're just gone. Nothing bad happens to
80s sitcoms. There's no such thing as, like, stuff that's
exactly. I think the garage doesn't show up for another few seasons when they want to remodel it. But it's... Yeah, it doesn't get like deep into like animal rights or anything, right? But like there's just a little bit worked in there. And it's less than on a show like Bones where Emily Deschanel, became a vegan, and she's like, she wanted to have these various sort of like pro animal episodes in it, right. And she's eating some like soy ice cream at one point, just like, not like really directly a thing. This is kind of more of an Easter egg, I guess. But that's the thing. It's like we often, I guess you had a show like Lassie, right, where you have a dog protagonist. But just, I don't know. It's not that deep in that regard, but it's there, it's there a little bit.
Yeah.
And I think it's there more than it would have been if the writers weren't open to that sort of thing. And, if Betty White wasn't so inclined.
Yeah. Yeah, I think in some ways Rose's perspective is really interesting, kind of what we were talking about before. Like, she is the daughter of a dairy farmer, and like I think in today's world we'd be like, oh my god, a dairy farmer. Like, if you're representing it from the kind of like super animal rights perspective, like that's going to be seen in a bad light. She, as you said, she isn't at the point yet where she's questioning the idea of humans owning animals and benefiting from the products that animals create. But in her mind, like, her father loves these animals. Her father treated these animals very well. And I don't remember, but I think there's a couple things where they talk about like, how like, basically kind of like small town farming, small farmer being better to the animals than like agribusiness type thing, which again, it's like, from some perspective, it might be like, well, you're still owning animals. Who cares? But like in that window, that's much better towards animal rights because you're not seeing animals as just for the product. And then, but again, 40 years ago, today, if you probably remade the show, you wouldn't have her be the child of a dairy farmer, or if you did, she'd be very critical of him. But at the time, that's how you told that story.
Yeah, I think, to me, it's less about better and more about less bad is how I would generally phrase it.
Yeah.
Right?
That's fair.
But it's like, it's not whatever. It's like it matters, right? Less bad is less bad. That makes a difference to the animals involved, right? Like, and we've talked about it in other areas where you can. It's like companies. Like, companies have employees. Like, the whole structure, I object to, but like some companies treat their employees less badly than other ones do.
Right. Another thing I want to pick up on, I mentioned how this show has become very beloved among like gay male community and then also queer community in general. And there's a lot of reasons why. The general progressiveness is a part of it. And there's some great articles that I'll post because they make the arguments even better than I do. Dorothy's bitchiness, Blanche's, man craziness. But one part of it is that, and one part I don't think I really resonate with, and I was talking to friends of mine in the queer community as well about why we resonate so much with it. This show is one of the first I can remember that's really about found family. Dorothy and Sophia are obviously mother and daughter, but a lot of the episodes are about how, Dorothy doesn't get along well with her, Blanche doesn't get along well with her sister. Dorothy has some, actually conflicts with her sister.
Rose and her sister. Actually, none of them get along well with their sisters.
Yeah, Blanche, Rose and her mother have conflicts. Like, all of them have conflicts with their kids at some point. And there's some ways in which I think there's a clear indication of, like, their blood families matter to them and they love their blood family very much. But these three are for all intents and purposes, sisters. And the four of them are a family now. And I think that story of, family isn't just blood. Family is the people who will be there for you. Family is the people who will get you the biggest gift at the party you throw. Blanket materialism, but there you go. It's a fun song. I think that story really resonates. And I was surprised to see it being so strong 40 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like Sophia kind of feels like all of their moms. In one episode, she says to either Blanche or Rose, like, I didn't go through however many hours of labor just to blah, blah, blah. And Dorothy's like, Mom, I'm your daughter. And she's like, oh, that's right. But yeah, it's a very, very, found family feeling. And it does feel like, in fact, there's an episode where I think when Rose is in the hospital, like, everybody else wants to be there and they're like, oh, family only. And, her daughter's like, like, back off. And then by the end of it, she's like, oh, I think she needs you there. You are her family as much as I am, kind of, and, it kind of comes around to that. But that very much, I enjoy that, I think, I've been fortunate in my life to, like, my family I've always gotten along with. Unfortunately, most of them died when I was fairly young. So, I don't have a very large family. I've married into a large family, but like that, I've always felt like people who you're related to by blood, it's like that doesn't really have that much meaning to me. Like, I care about the people I'm related to by blood because I care about them. Like, period. Right? Yeah. It's like, if we're not related, that doesn't make a difference to me. Like, I care as much about Lee's mom as I care about my mom, and that's like the maximum, whatever it goes up to, it's that on the scale, and they care about each other that way, and I think it's touching, and it's also it gives them the room to really have these fights and squabbles and disagreements, but to have it be very believable that it always works out at the end, because I think it is very convincing that they do really all care about each other that much. And if they didn't, like, maybe they would split up at some point, but they do care about each other that much. And so,
Yeah, I think I was really struck by it, especially with the conversations we have just been having about shows like Witcher, Daredevil, some of these others, where there's kind of a frustration of like, can't you just let the group be the group for a while? Why do they always have to have that huge fight, Cowboy Bebop at the end or whatever it is? And, from what I'm seeing, like, almost every episode there's some kind of tension, and they're often like sniping at each other, and sometimes it's good-naturedly, and sometimes it's really, really not. And, maybe once or twice a season, like in that episode where Dorothy doesn't believe Blanche, like, Blanche kicks her out, and they get very close to Dorothy moving out. But that's not every episode. And there's a heartfelt, it's not just that it's forgotten, it's that there's a heartfelt apology, and then Blanche being like, no, you're she doesn't say you're my sister, but she basically says, like, I can't kick you out, you're my family.
Yeah. I mean, I think she often uses the word best friend, or the phrase best friend, right? But it means the same thing in that context, I think. I will say that another show very much about found family that exists also in Miami, with also
Burn Notice.
Yeah, Burn Notice. Like, also I think does a good job of mostly keeping the gang together. It does. It's not as much of a comedy. I like that my favorite Miami shows are like Burn Notice, Golden Girls, Dexter. And then, like, I guess Miami Vice. But, like, there's
in both in Burn Notice and Dexter, the main character's parent is a major figure.
Exactly.
Source of advice and guidance.
You've got some elements of found family. Also, I wanted to say thank you for being a friend. And you had mentioned on one previous episode, you'd asked, like, if I did anything for the holiday, and I'm not like a big holiday person, but the biggest gift was indeed from you. So I felt like I wanted to mention that at some point, and then I didn't, but then here it felt like it actually it fits in with the theme song of the episode. So thank you.
Well, there you go. You're very I do canned goods, and I sent him and your family jalapeno jelly and blueberry chutney.
Excellent.
Have you gotten to open the jalapeno jelly
yet? I need to get some rice cakes, I think, are what I would like to have it on.
Cool.
But we haven't been shopping much lately.
Yeah, that's fair. So. That's fair. Nor have I. So a couple other just like kind of last things I want to touch on about the show. Just again in terms of like little issues it covers that just really surprised me for the way it was willing to deal with it. One was, like, obviously for the premise of the show, you need to have a reason why these three women are living on their own. And two of them are widowed. Dorothy is divorced. And now granted, she is divorced in a, like, very, very clear that, like, this is a, her husband, like, ran off with a stewardess to Hawaii. Like, this is not, it's very hard to find moral judgment with her I'm not going to find moral judgment for anyone for divorce, but you know what I mean? Like, they clearly make her, like, the wronged party. But they also don't leave it there. And there's an episode, again, in the first season where, her daughter's getting married. And again, this is the kind of, like, to me, this is the kind of sitcom logic of, like, her daughter says she's going to go to the Bahamas to get married because her parents can't be in the same room together. And she's like, oh, no, sweetie, don't do that. I'll put up with your father. We'll just have the wedding here. And so suddenly the wedding is going to be in 3 days in their house.
Because that's where they have a set.
Okay.
So.
Sure, exactly. But it winds up with her getting to confront her ex-husband in this very searing scene that brought tears to my eyes, thinking about how many people don't get this moment, where she basically is saying, because the whole thing is that he just walked out on her and then had his lawyer contact her. And there's a moment where she just rips into him and says all the things that that you did wrong. And he at least does a like, you're right, I'm so sorry, I apologize. And 99% of shows, I think, especially when it's a woman, you'd be expected for that person to take the high road, to say, it's okay, I forgive you, I just needed to say that, etc. Instead, she just cuts him off. She's like, no, I don't want to hear your apology. I just want the one thing that you didn't let me have before, the chance to say goodbye. Yeah. And then she makes him leave, and it's ending on her terms. And I remember being blown away, because you never see that level of like righteous anger, really, in terms of portrayed in that kind of a way, where it's not portrayed. It's not like we got to worry she's gonna get a knife. It's no, this is the closure she needed.
Yeah, she gets to actually finally say her piece, right? And she's just like, this is what I'm gonna say, and you don't get to say anything. You already said what you could say by leaving, right? And having your lawyer contact me. So this isn't about what you have to say. This is about me airing grievances, and then not just being fine afterwards, but feeling a little better, and then he becomes an intermittent character throughout. And I think they have a fairly complex relationship as the series goes on, but not one where she's just, where it's just like, oh, they just get back together because why not? But also not one where it's like, when they don't get back together, it's like totally contrived. It's like, no, it makes sense,
So, quick spoiler for something that happens in a much later season involving this plot line. But for some reason, I'm watching on Hulu, and I have Hulu Live TV. And so Hulu would get confused as to whether I wanted to like keep watching it in order versus watching it on syndication, because it's on syndication everywhere all the time. So I wound up watching the episode in which he says goodbye to him. And then the next time we turned it on and we thought, watch the next episode, it's the episode where Stan is back and sleeps with her sister.
the hurricane, right? Like, there's a hurricane.
We were just like, really? These two episodes are back to back? How could they do that? No. Okay, there's actually 6 seasons in between those two. But another thing just to bring up is, you always want to kind of think about like how intentional is the commentary of a show. This show was made in the 80s. Reagan was president. The moral majority, as the religious right was then called, was very ascendant, was very loud. In Miami, you had a very, very loud public anti-gay, I think it's Anita Bryant, but like a very strong, like, get the gays out of our teacher, our teachers, all this kind of stuff, gay panic. And to me, I think it's very, like, the fact that this show is being so critical in that time and that place is just one of the things to remember about it. Like, this wasn't doing it when it was safe. This was a very intentional... I wasn't paying attention to this part of the conversation, but I have to imagine that when conservatives talked about Hollywood liberals, Golden Girls is probably like in their top 3.
Yeah, no doubt. I could see that. It definitely has the feel of a show that takes place during, the Reagan and then later during the Bush years. And I think Bush actually comes to visit one time, like for a handshake, right. And Dorothy's going to like tell him off. And spoiler, she doesn't, but she's still mad. She's like, I think he got the point. Yeah. The message, but like, it definitely feels like it was, going against the grain of a lot of what, a strong portion of the United States was doing and thinking, but at the same time, a large portion wasn't also, right? I mean, it's always been a very divided place. And just then it was sort of like, the presidency was certainly very, by a landslide, right? Like 1984, I think is the first election I ever saw. And just watching the entire map practically turn red was like...
Not Minnesota.
Right,
Minnesota.
Right. Everything but Minnesota and what was New Hampshire? Or was it only Minnesota?
I think District of Columbia.
Yeah, right.
Which I do also have to say... watching this show with a woman, my partner from Minnesota, and every now and then being able to tease her. My wife is a wonderful, sweet, amazing woman, incredible mind, brilliantly intelligent. Has a little bit of small townness to her from time to time, and so being able to have fun with her about Rose is a true delight.
I can see that. Rose being from Minnesota.
Yes, exactly.
St. Olaf.
Which apparently is the rival school to where Mary went in Carleton.
Really?
So Mary particularly has a hatred of sloth, as they call it.
Hilarious.
So any other kind of particular episodes you want to mention or issues? Both. There's one that I want to mention of something where I feel like they got it incredibly wrong. That kind of says something at the time. But for you, any other things you want to bring up?
There's I guess there's two things. I'll go with one of them first, and then you can do your thing, and then I have a thing that's like not an episode. The episode, I'm not sure if it's one or two. It might be 2-episode arc, but it's like Rose gets a letter saying that she got blood infusion at the hospital when she'd had her, I think, her gallbladder out, and that it might have contained HIV antibodies, and so that's a whole thing. And, and Rose is like, I just can't believe that, I would maybe end up with HIV. If anybody would, it would be you, Blanche. And Blanche is like, HIV, AIDS is not a bad person's disease, Rose. Like, and so I think that's both, this was during the heights of the AIDS epidemic. And that, again, I think is a very probably, kind of a queer friendly message, right? Where, because I think AIDS was often framed as being this like moral failing or something. And
it's the gay disease or the drug use.
Right. Exactly. And so I think just having saying that sentence even on national television, I think is powerful, and then the way everybody reacts, like Sophia's like, oh, I don't want to drink out of the same mug as Rose, or I think that episode just like confronting that issue at the time, I think was a pretty big deal.
And it's funny because like it sounds cliche, but like at that time, a lot more families did like watch TV together. Some families definitely still do, but like I imagine that there were a lot of families where like they would watch this episode and then like parents would talk to their kids about things and stuff like that. And like I love when shows can help start those discussions.
That's why this is a podcast.
Yeah, exactly. The episode I wanted to point out, and I think there probably are some of these, and this is to me, this isn't an attack on the show, but it's a way of sort of saying like the show is still only like the show is viewing the world through the lenses that it has, and so there's some things that it misses. And I think this episode is a great example of where it really does fantastically badly. Dorothy, as a teacher, is tutoring a young Hispanic student, played by a very young Mario Lopez with a truly epic 80s mullet.
Yes.
And he writes this really wonderful poem about what America means to him, and she enters it into a contest and gets him a lot of attention because it wins an award, including the attention of the INS, at what now ICE is called. And he winds up having to be like facing deportation and eventually being deported. And, Dorothy says, don't worry, I'm going to fight. I'm going to bring you back. That, of course, is never mentioned again because, sitcoms, that's just how they work. But the conceit of the episode is clearly that it's unfair that he has to be sent home, but still, it was wrong of him to kind of run away because if you work within the legal system will work out for you. And also that it should, like, Dorothy feels a little stupid for not having thought about it, but it's kind of presented as like, oh, Dorothy, how could you know? Whereas today, I feel like we would, it's kind of like, you have to be thinking about that kind of a thing, so the dual fact of Dorothy being presented as like that it's an okay thing to have done this without having thought like maybe this person isn't documented, maybe I could get them into trouble or some other kind, but even more so, the whole show's fundamental, like, if you work through the legal system, everything's going to be okay, young Latino man. Like, both of them just seem so wildly out of touch. But again, at the time, like, it was probably a pretty progressive episode for pushing what it did about, deportation being wrong. And so, yeah, Mary, we watched that. We're like, okay, well, that's one where just the writers were just really not seeing what we would see today.
Yeah, I think, it's interesting because, well, first of all, we talked about Bush and Reagan, and there are clips of like the 1980 Republican debate, like presidential candidate debate between Bush and Reagan, and they're like arguing about immigration policy in a way that like that's like how Democrats argue about it now.
Oh, yeah.
Which like to me is still totally unacceptable. Like I'm like I think it's just like a human rights violation to have borders that you don't allow people to cross outside of very specific circumstances. But like to see kind of how far thoughts have come and how just absurdly just openly racist and xenophobic the right wing has become, and like kind of how little progress has been made. I feel like negative progress has been made, really. But I do feel like that was an episode where the show was trying to be progressive, and I think there's an extent to which it is, what happens in the show is an indictment of the idea that you can just go with the system and things will work out, right? Because I feel like the point of the episode should be that Dorothy's wrong, and like, first of all, she messed up by drawing the attention in the first place, right? Like you probably shouldn't submit things without somebody's consent. Like that just, right? Yeah. That's just like a basic
just
thing.
In general, any circumstance, but especially one where like there might be some reason that drawing official attention to someone not the best idea.
But I mean, like regardless, but then on top of it, right? And then, I do think the show kind of understands that, you know what? I'm unsure. Like, I think I might sort of headcanon it a little bit that like the show understands that like Dorothy's wrong there, but it doesn't necessarily paint her as really being wrong. Like it's, she's clearly wrong in her thought that it'll work out. And like, she's like, oh, well now I'm going to fight and try and make it work, which like it probably doesn't, because that's, things don't work out very well in that regard most of the time. But yeah, I think they definitely could have been more clearly critical of Dorothy there. And in general, I think one of the show's weaknesses is, representations, particularly like of people of color, and it's, it has the feeling of like trying, but kind of missing the mark, I think, a lot of the time. Yeah. Like there's the episode with the Cuban boxer. I don't know if you watched that one.
I don't remember that one.
But it plays on, people's stereotypes of what a Cuban boxer is or whatever. And the idea, I think, is that it's trying to undermine those assumptions. But at the same time, it kind of plays with them in a way where you're kind of laughing with them, right? Or that's kind of the goal.
Yeah.
And it's like there's very few black characters. There's very few Asian characters. When there's often... it's not often the best. Sometimes there is one where Sophia makes a friend in the park that I think is like actually really quite lovely, and it deals with, I don't know whether it's Alzheimer's or some other kind of cognitive decline, but it's like one of the saddest episodes, really. But yeah, it just, I feel like overall it's just a show that was trying to do a lot of things, did them better than people were generally doing at the time, but also for sure, missed the mark. Often, and to the extent that that's the failings of the writers, the producers, the network executives are like, oh, you can't do that. We don't know, but
I would love to read more about this to find out why. And Sophia being from Sicily makes a lot of sense. I will go to my deathbed insisting that excuse me. I will go to my deathbed insisting that Dorothy Spornak is one of the best examples of an older Jewish woman on television. And you can tell me she's not Jewish, but like, and granted, B. Arthur herself is very Jewish. She herself was an outspoken Jewish advocate. She actually found out played Yenta in the first production of Fiddler on the Roof on Broadway, which is kind of awesome. She also had a very long, wonderful career, did a lot of very progressive things, tackling abortion in a TV show in the 70s when she was on Maude. But her character just reads, to me at least, and there's a lot of other great articles about this as well. Her character reads as so Jewish. And I think, granted, she's Catholic from Queens, it could be pretty similar. I imagine that in some original draft, she's Jewish, and then they changed it for producers. But who knows? That's my own question.
It's certainly possible. So Estelle Getty is also Jewish.
Oh, is she the woman who plays Sophia?
So
that.
And they're both from New York. The characters are right. So Dorothy was born in Brooklyn, and Sophia was born in Sicily. But Dorothy grew up in Brooklyn, and that's where Sophia was for.
I think Queens actually. No, she said.
Brooklyn. Yeah.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah, it's definitely. Wait, can I possibly be wrong about this? No. There might.
She mentioned maybe she lived in Queens with Stan, but she mentioned something of being in Queens.
There might have been a mention of Queens at some point, but definitely picture it. Brooklyn, 1935. Yeah.
That's fair. That's fair.
And that's where, and they have an episode where they're friends of Sophia and Sal, who is Dorothy's father, Sophia's husband, who died before the show starts. The character does. They have a pizza knish stand with a Jewish couple, or with Sal's Jewish friend, and then he shows up on the show. And so, I think I'm not disagreeing with the premise, right? But I also think that there is a certain, a lot of sort of stereotypical Jewishness I mean stereotypical specifically, right? Yeah. I think also is kind of, there's an intersection between stereotypical Jewishness and like stereotypical New Yorker and like ethnic New Yorker. And so I think I wouldn't be shocked if they're like, oh, you can't make him Jewish, make him Italian, right? And some of the jokes, like knowing that like the actresses are both Jewish and that maybe a lot of the writers are like not Sicilian, it's like, like, is this like a negative Italian stereotype? And it's like, well, yeah, in some ways, but like, it also feels like it's trying to be this kind of like loving Italian stereotype, but like, I don't know if somebody doesn't like it. I'm certainly not going to tell them they shouldn't. I mean, I recently found out that like Cuomo apparently wouldn't watch The Godfather. I'm like,
oh yeah, no, Italians in the 70s found The Godfather horribly offensive.
But it's so cool. It's like, as much as like, they're the villains, they're the heroes too, but
yeah, no, and I get that, and I think it goes in both ways. Like, I think there definitely is a sort of like being from Brooklyn becomes its own thing, but like also I think about like, statements that Jack Kirby made where he said like, yeah, like on some level he would have loved Captain America to be Jewish, Steve Rogers to be Jewish, and in many ways he kind of was, but you couldn't tell that story at that point yet. So him being an Irish kid from Brooklyn made him much more of an all-American kid. And I think like it's why I think it was so important for a lot of people that Peter B. Parker in the Into the Spider-Verse movie was Jewish, because also like a lot of things about the Peter Parker character that could be read as Jewish, could be read as many other things, to be sure. But yeah, so it's one interesting thing. What's your last thing you want to bring up? My last
thing was just like about moms and found family. And I grew up with my mom and my dad until I was 8 and change, and then my dad died, and then I grew up with my mom for the next 10 years basically, right? But for I don't know, half of that, most of that even, I would have, like, there was 3 friends whose houses I would often stay at on, like, Friday and or Saturday night. One of them was yours, right? At your mother's house. One was Logan, who's, sometimes been on the pod, at his mother's house. And one was my friend Andrew at his dad was around for a while, but then his dad had a heart attack, literally died, got brought back to life, wasn't really the same, and then died again eventually. But like growing up in kind of like all of my found families were these like matriarchal families, basically, you know, a single mother, and so I feel like the show kind of in some way has more meaning for me in that way as well. Just
Yeah,
you know,
I can see that.
Just having, you know, and all of these moms were like second, third, and fourth moms for me, you know, and even when I was a kid, like there were all these families in the building also, and so having that sort of combination of the sort of found family, and then, you know, all the characters are moms, they're all grandmothers too, you know.
Right.
It just, I think that's just something that, like, when it comes to representation, I think people often talk about like seeing themselves represented, right? Or like so-and-so people should see themselves represented. And I think that's absolutely true. But I think it's similarly important, more or less, whatever, but similarly important to see other people that we care about represented, as well as people we don't even know, you know? And so, yeah.
No, I think it's really true, because I don't think of, granted, my mother had a lot of sort of social issues, and so for her was particular this, but like, I know she had a very good female friendship for quite a long time, you know, and that was a very important part of her life. And later in her life, she didn't. And I kind of, you know, we're talking about kind of wishing my mother had friends like the Golden Girls. Also, like, to me, one thing I think is interesting in terms of the way we think of these things, I always thought Grace and Frankie, which is another great show about older women, that it was kind of like the Golden Girls Part 2. Grace and Frankie, those characters are Sophia's age, or like maybe a little younger. Like, but we're now in like the 5th season, I think, and Grace is 81. You know, so they start out 20 to 25 years older than the Golden Girls do. In my head, they were the same thing, because again, just the awful ways we think about these things. But yeah, no, I totally get that about the found family, and you know, I think I can't really relate to it because it's not necessarily the lives my mother led, but it's a life I could have seen her leading, you know, and especially if nothing else, because one of the things that so much of the show takes place in the kitchen. Right. And so often it's the, like, you know, someone's upset. Often it's Sophia, but often it's Rose often, but any of them, like another one of them therefore is preparing food for the others, you know, and it just like, you know,
that was,
I'm trying to get teary-eyed here. Like, the movie Encanto, I absolutely loved and adored. And one thing I loved about it is the idea of the mother healing people through food. You know, you I'm sure remember, like when we were kids, we'd go out and we'd come home and mom would have like a pot of tomato soup and a loaf of bread, because I was a super picky eater. You were a vegan. There weren't many things the two of us could eat, but like that's what she'd make. And I love that the so much of the show happens in the kitchen, because that's how they show each other love.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's only one of the things, you know, I love so much about your mom, you know. But yeah, that I will always remember that. And, you know, her like trying to find the right kind of, like when I still ate some cheese, but like not cheese with rennet, her being like, oh, well, ricotta doesn't have, you know, she's like, so I can make manicotti. And I was like, okay, cool, you know.
Which is better than when I was incredibly proud, because I told Paul I'd found a way to make cheddar cheese sticks without eggs. At which point Paul pointed out
I was like, do they have cheese in them? So, you know, your heart's in the right place, but your mom was she was a little better at it at the time. I think you've had years to...
She learned more. She learned more. All right. I think it's a good place we can wrap up. Paul, any of the last thing? I think it's a good place we can wrap up. Paul, Zen Madman, what's Zen Madman doing these days?
Zen Madman ate a vegan cheesecake on the day after Betty White died. So that was my way of honoring Betty White.
I appreciate it.
And the Golden Girls, who are always eating cheesecake. I had a Daya strawberry vegan cheesecake that I somehow got for $2 because I think they don't make them anymore, sadly. But yeah, what's Zen Madman doing? Zen Madman's tweeting. Zen Madman might start streaming again. Zen Madman can turn Zen Madman's neck all the way to the right now, which is a great relief.
That's impressive.
But migraines have been happening, I think. So we'll see. But yeah, Zen Madman on all the places.
Awesome. Yeah, and we might be streaming episodes of this, recording sessions of this. So if you're excited about that, write into Zen Madman, or you can write into me, The Ethical Panda. Go to theethicalpanda.com. You'll find on my website all the places you can find me, Facebook, Twitter, etc. I might be going back onto TikTok. I'm not sure yet. In a Golden Girls-esque attempt to show that I'm still young and spry. But you can email us, tweet at us, Facebook. Let us know what you think. Did you love Golden Girls? Did you learn something more about the show today? Do you want to go back and rewatch it? Are you someone for whom it's just hopelessly dated and you can't get into it? All that's totally legitimate too. Let us know, especially let us know if you want us to be streaming. I'm having myself, Paul. Thank you all so much, and have a great day.
Thank you all for being friends. I don't know. That's I tried something.